Good day and welcome back to the Ottawa History Hub podcast. In our last episode, we concluded with the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701. This brought an end to almost a century of conflict between Iroquois, Anishinaabe, French, Dutch, and English. Over that period, the indigenous people of all local nations lost about 75% of their total population in the stretch of land from the Great Lakes to the northeast corner of what's now the United States. Political and cultural structures were demolished, and the traditional economy had been completely subverted by the dawn of the 18th century. It was great that there was now a practical peace treaty, but the underlying social conditions made it very difficult for long-term prosperity. And it wasn't just the indigenous nations that had undergone huge change. In 1665, the Swedish communities in Fort Trinity and Fort Christina were captured by the Dutch, ending the Nordic presence in the Americas beyond Greenland. 9 years later, in 1664, the Netherlands abandoned their expanded North American colony and continued their commercial colonialism in the Caribbean, where they found the smaller sugar islands to be much more stable and profitable. The English had managed to maintain close ties with the Haudenosaunee, who had tried to play them off against the French. England's abundance of willing settlers grew their presence in North America by building now 13 colonies on the Atlantic seaboard, with new towns, cities, and farms being settled at such a rate that the restrictive limit of settlements presented by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy on their western flank would not be able to hold the English at bay forever. For the French, their population was a fraction of that living under the Cross of St. George, but their land claim dwarfed any European or indigenous claim in North America. The new France that appeared on French maps stretched from Labrador through the Great Lakes all the way to the Mississippi tributaries, and involved a spattered collection of islands across the Caribbean. However, without the population or military presence to enforce the claim, a claim is all it was. Most of the indigenous nations living under the Sun King, Louis XIV, who reigned an astonishing 61 years from 1654 to 1715, would probably have been surprised to hear that their lands were so claimed. This was due to the pure sensibility of the French administration. For the French, Canada, a byword for New France, was a purely commercial endeavor. They were not there to build a new nation in the wilderness for God's new Israel, as many English and Spanish policymakers understood their roles. The French were there to collect fur, amber, fish, whale, gold that never seemed to manifest for them the way it had for the Spanish and the Portuguese, and to find a safe route to China, which was increasingly and obviously not just past the Lachine Falls. Throughout the Great Lakes, the French had established trading depots where major rivers hit the lakes. This included outposts that have since become cities throughout the Great Lakes region, including what's now Kingston in 1673, Thunder Bay in 1679, Sault Ste. Marie in 1688, Detroit in 1701, and with special concessions from local indigenous nations after the Montreal Peace, Toronto in 1750, Fort Wayne, Indiana in 1717, Green Bay, Wisconsin in 1727. The French had a large trading network managed by merchants, not settling farmers or clergymen, and a network for missionaries, typically though not exclusively Jesuit. After 1701, the Ottawa River had returned to its role as the highway connecting northern Nipissing and Innu communities to trade in Montreal. The Kitchissippirini and other Algonquins had been largely displaced by the Beaver Wars, while some small communities were reestablishing themselves after the storm of the last century. Most of the Ottawa Valley was considered to be Algonquin territory and used for seasonal hunting rather than permanent settlement at this point. While the Peace of Montreal held in the New World, the Old World still occasionally called out for blood. The War of Austrian Succession from 1740 to 1748 didn't end well for anyone concerned, and so it carried over into the so-called 7 Years' War from 1756 to 63, when England, Prussia, and Portugal fought France, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain, in what Winston Churchill would later call the real First World War, before the 1914-1918 conflict absconded with that title. The war was fought in Europe, the Caribbean, India, and elsewhere, but the North American theater is the most important to our story. At the outbreak of the war in 1756, there were 55,000 French colonists in Canada, with 18,000 in Quebec City, 22,000 in Montreal, and 4,000 in Trois-Rivières. There were also an additional 25,000 in combined Acadia, so New Brunswick, mainland Nova Scotia, Ile Royale, modern-day Cape Breton, and Ile Saint-Jean, which is modern-day Prince Edward Island. While the populations of the cities of Quebec and Montreal were similar to New York and Boston at the time, Canada lacked the agriculture or industry to maintain its own defense. Aside from a handful of militias, officered and equipped from the mother country, France was wholly responsible for the defense of the trading network. The colonies of New England had a combined population of 1,160,000 people. That is a little more than 21 times the population of the French Dominion, which was roughly 21 times the area. Despite the discrepancies of population, the English and French both had about 3,500 regular soldiers from Europe in charge of defense before the outbreak of the war. England's pool of recruiting militias was obviously much larger. Beyond the soldiers on the St. Lawrence River and the Gulf, the French had an elaborate alliance system throughout the Great Lakes. This alliance system was strong enough to bring furs to market, but the military might of the non-Five Nations indigenous people could not compete with their traditional enemies, the Haudenosaunee. The Haudenosaunee in turn maintained their alliance with the British. The British were more immediately dangerous to the Five Nations land, as their surplus population kept migrating into Five Nations territory and setting up farmsteads. So the Haudenosaunee believed that by reinforcing this alliance, the English would tell their farmers to stop doing this, or maybe settle in the far south and annoy someone else. Also, despite the last 50 years of formal peace, they had experienced a long-term conflict with the French that dated back to the Battle of Sorel in 1610. While the remains of the Wendat, Algonquin, Ottawa, and Innu sided with the French, the Mohawk, Oneida, Cayuga, Seneca, Onondaga, Susquehannock, and Tuscarora aligned with the English, and in much greater numbers. Another English advantage in the 7 Years' War lay in the strong navy, allowing the army to move around faster and reprovisioned more easily, and granted them the ability to be choosier when it came to selecting where and when the fighting would take place. The English forces quickly moved through the Maritimes, capturing Louisbourg after an 8-week siege, and occupying what would today constitute PEI, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia from the French. Under the command of the 32-year-old young pup James Wolfe, the English forces landed at Ile d'Orléans in June of 1759. Ile d'Orléans is a large island dividing the St. Lawrence immediately east of Quebec City. From there, the English were to be easily supplied by the sea. The French, in turn, were cut off from any direct European support, and the great fortress of Quebec was now at the far edge of English cannon fire. The cannons couldn't really aim with any accuracy at this distance, but that didn't really matter. The point was that the city could be bombarded day or night from the safety of the island, and there was nothing that the French defenders could do about it. For the civilians in town, one could only imagine how the walls that once felt as if they would keep you safe were now a coffin, denying you access to the world of the living. The French commander of the city's defenders, Louis-Joseph de Montcalm-Crozon, was a conservative, defense-oriented commander. While the English could haphazardly lob cannon at the walls, occasionally flying randomly into the town, this was not enough to force a surrender. The French had to wait out the English, who would eventually need to be reinforced and could only last for so long. Even though it was still summer in 1759, winter would come, as it did every year, and the French were prepared for it, whereas the English were tented up on a windswept island on the river. They would leave or freeze to death in time. And while supplies from Europe weren't coming, supplies from Montreal and Trois-Rivières were. While the Algonquin couldn't bring a large military force to bear, they could bring supplies and intelligence. The English on Ile d'Orléans numbered slightly less than 7,700, which is great for soldiers on a field, but it also means 7,700 people who need to be fed every day, who need to be paid, who produce human waste on an island that needs to be cleaned like everywhere else, otherwise there'd be another outbreak of another disease, which has been a recurring problem in our narrative. The English were opposed by 13,390 French soldiers, including 400 Odawa and 140 Acadian survivors. In a letter to his mother, Wolfe noted that the Marquis de Montcalm is at the head of a great number of bad soldiers, and I am at the head of a small number of good ones, that wish for nothing so much as to fight him. But the wary old fellow avoids an action, doubtful of the behavior of his army. Daily small ships would probe up and down the St. Lawrence, looking for holes in the defenses and comfortable places to land. English leadership considered upstream on the north side to cut off supplies from Montreal. This would run the risk of a pincer attack from both sides. But the point was moot, as another site was to be chosen. L'Anse au Foulon was a small cove at the bottom of tall cliffs that had cannons up at the top and was not considered a reasonable spot to land. The English forces would have to disembark at the bottom of the 53-meter-tall cliffs and climb up to capture the cannon. The brigade officers thought that this plan was foolhardy, and that Wolfe was overly aggressive due to his youth and his noted dependence on opiates. I lack the medical knowledge to say with certainty how much opium is too much opium, but it was apparently bad enough to be noticed by his co-workers, which is usually a bad sign. In addition to the risk of climbing an exposed cliff at night, it would also mean that they would not be able to bring horses, and raising cannon through a pulley system so close to the French stronghold would also present challenges. Lieutenant General Robert Monckton, the namesake of Moncton, New Brunswick, and villainous future administrator of the Acadian deportations, agreed to support the general's plan once Wolfe said that he would lead the advance guard personally. On 13 September, the elite of the English forces led the silent, nighttime climb up the cliffs and overran the defenders, who had been lax, believing that no sensible attacker would bother them in such a defensible position. In their defense, that was a reasonable assumption. By the time word got to Montcalm, the bulk of the English forces had already mustered on a farm belonging to a local farmer, Abraham Martin. The Plains of Abraham is not related to the biblical patriarch, but the title sounds a little more grandiose than the Battle of Farmer Abe's Carrot Patch. Montcalm was forced to decide between meeting the English on the field or remaining in the fortress of Quebec. The advantage of staying in the fortress is that they could continue to wait out the British and hope that the winter was early this year, or that reinforcements from Europe would come, or that there would be a peaceful resolution in Europe that would then call home the English soldiers. The disadvantage was that the English could be reinforced right on the French doorstep, and the wild cannon shots would now add accuracy to their malevolence. Every hour that Montcalm waited, more reinforcements from Ile d'Orléans could be raised to the Plains of Abraham. With a small enough force to guard the headland, they could land horse safely to the west and eventually reinforce with cavalry as well as artillery. Montcalm decided to attack, and both he and Wolfe were fatally and famously injured in the battle that killed 596 British and 644 French soldiers, and the English won the day. Jean-Baptiste Nicolas Roche de Ramsay offered surrender to Admiral Charles Saunders and General George Townsend if the English would accept their 13 demands. Many of them were fairly standard terms of surrender, but some are important for what would happen in Quebec once the French crown withdrew and the English administration took over. These conditions of surrender set the stage for a colony with a different legal system than the rest of the British colonies, and a cultural separation between the French from France and the French in Quebec. Number 1, French soldiers were sent home with military honors, equipment, and rations, on the promise not to make war against the English. This meant an end to the military presence, but not the civilian leadership. Number 2, the inhabitants of Quebec would be allowed to keep their homes, goods, and privileges. So, Not just no looting, but keeping legal rights and privileges. This would be important for a very long time. Number 3, militia members are local and won't be sent to France and wouldn't be treated as criminals. No expulsion of the French that called Canada home. Number 4, the property of the soldiers sent back to France will not be taken. Number 5, the inhabitants wouldn't be forced from their houses and compelled to leave. This is exactly what would happen in Acadia. This demand ensured a continued French-speaking population in Quebec, as opposed to other conquered territories. Number 6, the rights of the Catholic Church would be protected. This allowed the Roman Catholic Church to continue its prominent role amongst the French population, first in the city of Quebec, but then across the colony. The English wouldn't ban Catholicism, much as they wanted to, but they wouldn't allow its reinforcement from Europe, forcing the religion to become a much more locally based rather than international version of the Roman Confession. Number 7, there'll be an inventory of artillery. The English would keep a hold of this, but not the normal weapons that the soldiers were allowed to carry home. Number 8, that the sick and wounded, chaplains, physicians, surgeons, and apothecaries would be protected. Number 9, before the main English force would be allowed into the city, advance parties would enter as guards around churches and convents. This was to prevent the common soldiers from looting, which is normally expected of a victorious force. Number 10, that the King's Lieutenant in Quebec be able to inform the Marquis de Vaudreuil, the Governor-General of the colony now based in Montreal, as to what had passed so that he may inform France, though in reality the defeated soldiers would arrive in France before word got there from Vaudreuil. Number 11, there would be no reprisals after the surrender. Number 12, the French civilian government in Quebec be allowed to peacefully return to France rather than be taken as prisoners. This was allowed, but they were not allowed to take any documents with them. And finally, number 13, if the eventual peace between England and France returns Quebec to the French, a distinct possibility as it had happened before in the last century, then the English must leave and allow Vaudreuil to return to office. This was a legacy of the Kirk brothers refusing to return Quebec in 1629 and 32, despite peace having been declared between France and Britain. So, unlike Acadia, which was conquered outright, Quebec surrendered, and the terms of the surrender would have lasting effects in law and culture. This did not end the war in September. The English waited in Quebec until reinforcements arrived in May of 1760, before continuing on to take Montreal. French forces would unsuccessfully try to retake Quebec the following April at the Battle of Saint-Foy, where the British lost 1,182 to death, wound, or capture, and the French 833 in one of the bloodiest days on what would become Canadian soil. Nouvelle France was occupied and now a possession of the Crown of Great Britain. But part of the surrender meant that French civilians would remain unmolested, allowed to carry out commerce and religion in their own way. This set a tone for the development of Quebec, or Canada East or Lower Canada, as a distinct French and Catholic society within a largely Anglophone and Protestant polity. It also allowed for the rights and privileges of French civil code to be practiced instead of British civil and common law. At least for now, and as it would turn out, this would be a curious point in the Canadian legal system going forward. The reason that these generous terms were agreeable to the English is that nobody could be sure who would be the masters in Quebec when the peace was signed. The peace was signed in Paris in 1763, where, predictably, the main interests of the conference were the fate of the European holdings. Colonial holdings in North America, India, Africa, and the Caribbean were an afterthought to this. The Treaty of Paris ended Nouvelle France. The Canadian territories of Quebec and the Maritimes went to England, and large parts of Louisiana went to Spain. England got some of France's holding in the Caribbean, but it was there that the French really dug in their heels to defend their interests, not in the north. François-Marie Arouet, writing under the nom de plume Voltaire, famously quipped, "A few acres of snow in Canada was hardly something to fight over," and that French people would now have to buy their furs from English traders instead of French ones at an only slightly inflated price. He also complained that all the French crown was able to do in the Americas was establish a colony in Canada, a country covered with snow and ice 8 months of the year, inhabited by barbarians, bears, and beavers. Ugh. The reason I'm including Voltaire's slander as an epitaph for New France is to illustrate that New France was always a commercial endeavor and never a part of the French public consciousness. There were no mass settlements like that of the English, Spanish, or Portuguese. It was expensive to protect and administer, and the revenues for furs had lost considerable luster since the Beaver Wars. Many in France were happy to be rid of Quebec, and the French in Quebec were not happy about the English occupation, but their nostalgia for the motherland was never glowing. This episode of the podcast represents the last part of the first part of the history of Ottawa. It illustrates the regional context that existed when it became a crown dominion. I hope that you haven't been turned off by the absence of a city of Ottawa in our narrative. But that's the thing about history, is you're always working on the background and context. The first permanent settlement won't happen until 1802, by which time Quebec would have been divided along the Ottawa River, renamed again, gone through its first and second redistricting, all before Filman Wright decided that it would be a good place to settle. Thank you for your patience, and I hope that you've enjoyed this leisurely stroll. Thank you for listening to the Ottawa History Podcast. When we come back in the next episode, which will happen early in the new year, we will begin Chapter 2, the British Administration and Bytown, from 1759 to 1855. Our American neighbors decide that rather than pay for their fair share of the 7 Years' War debt, they would declare independence of all things, and just wrongly assume that the occupied French colonies would join them. Surprises are coming. Please take a moment to give us a 5-star review on whatever podcatcher you use, or preferably write a short review. This helps the algorithm promote a podcast, which is so essential as I start out. I do really appreciate that. This show is written, performed, and edited by myself, Brendan Ray. You can send me an email at ottawahistoryhub@gmail.com. Follow me on Facebook at Ottawa History Hub, or X Twitter at OttHistoryHub. That's at OttHistoryHub. Please visit our website at ottawahistoryhub.com. Take care, everybody. Have a happy Christmas, a happy New Year. Advance Ottawa, en avance!